Welcome to Lab Coat Optional from Arizona State University, the show where advanced research meets everyday curiosity. I'm Pete Soroka, and I'm here at the AAAS annual meeting, and I'm nervous because there's a robot dog following me. Hey, welcome to a bonus episode of Lab Coat Optional from Arizona State University. I'm Pete Soroka, and I'm here at the American Association for the Advancement of Science annual meeting in Phoenix, Arizona. It's like a big gathering of super smart people who are trying to use science to advance public good. I honestly can't even believe that they let me in the door. The theme of this year's meeting is science at scale, and today's guests are two researchers whose work embody that theme. They are leveraging artificial intelligence to make sense of vast, fragmented data and solve deeply human problems. The pair are the winner and runner-up for the inaugural ASU-Science Prize for Transformational Impact, which is presented by Arizona State University and AAAS. In her award-winning essay submission, Meha Jain from the University of Michigan describes her research, which uses satellite data and artificial intelligence to examine the effects of climate change on small-scale agriculture in the global south, which has impacts on our environment and our food supply. Runner-up Mayank Kejriwal from the University of Southern California created an AI-powered investigative search tool which helps law enforcement track and disrupt sex trafficking online. Stay tuned as special guest host Dr. Lara Ferry, Vice President for Research at ASU Knowledge Enterprise and friend of the show, interviews these two outstanding researchers about their work to make sense of messy data and change human lives.
Welcome, Meha. Thank you for joining me.
Thanks so much for the invitation. I'm really excited.
Well, I'm really glad to have you here today, joining us all the way from Australia, so thank you for making the trip. Your work sits right at that interface of climate change and agriculture, so obviously of vital importance. Our food security is a key worry, I think, for many countries right now. And your work focuses on the global south and a group that you call smallholder agriculture. Can you define what smallholder is for us?
So the way that I define smallholder is one is by field size. So typically these are fields that are less than 2 hectares in size. And largely I'm also working with family farms. So these are, whole families working together to produce agricultural production, both for home consumption, but also to sell to the market.
Right. And this is most of the production in the global south. Is that right?
Exactly. Yeah. In India, I think it's about 90% or more of production is under these systems.
So your work, as I understand it, uses great technology like satellite imagery and AI to try to understand how climate change is affecting these food producers and how they can adjust to a changing regime right now. Can you tell us more about what has AI brought to this project? What is the addition that AI has been able to bring?
So one challenge that we face in smallholder systems is that they're typically data scarce. So unlike places like the U.S. where you might have a lot of ground data collected by the government or different agencies, you don't always see that in the regions where I work. So one thing that's been really great about AI is we're trying to use methods that can allow us to create high accuracy models using less training data.
Big picture data allow us to see patterns that were sort of previously invisible, and you have this nice mixed methods approach where you're using sort of small and large scale data. But how do you get that information and solutions sort of to farmers on the ground?
So I largely actually work with organizations who are working with farmers. So I'm not personally directly providing the information to farmers. And that's for several reasons. So there are so many wonderful organizations on the ground who have these close relationships established with farmers, have wonderful kind of networks in place and information dissemination techniques in place to work with local farmers. So really, I work with those organizations to help them identify potential solutions, identify where they can be targeted at scale, and then they're the ones who actually implement.
And it's amazing that you're networked in that way. I work with a lot of faculty in my role who have incredible ideas that they're pursuing in their laboratory, in their research, but they don't know how to translate that, if you will, how to take that into the user space and make sure that it's actually being implemented or having an impact, be that a new technological thing or a solution like you're finding that someone can apply. How did you get networked with those folks that are in country on the ground?
So I've been very, very fortunate to have been linked up with amazing organizations that are doing this work and are also really keen to collaborate. So the specific organizations that I mostly work with now are through the CGIAR network, which is an international research organization working on agricultural development across the world. They're headquartered in Mexico, but then have local offices in many countries across the globe. And I became connected with this group during my postdoc. I did a postdoc at Stanford University, and my advisor there had been working with this group broadly over the last 10, 15 years. And through him, I got connected. And it's been a really wonderful experience. And the collaborations have just kind of flourished and deepened since then.
And you mentioned India earlier, the region where you work. It's the primary focus of the essay that you wrote that we're featuring here. Why India?
So India, I have both personal reasons and food security reasons that I look at it. So India is the largest producer of rice globally. It's the second largest producer of wheat. So it really is an agricultural powerhouse. At the same time, as I mentioned, it's largely being produced by these smallholder production systems that are very vulnerable to climate change. And India is also facing significant environmental challenges. So India is the largest consumer of fresh water worldwide, largely being used for irrigation and agriculture. And over 50% of its aquifers are depleted. At the same time, it's also a hotspot for crop residue burning, which leads to really low air quality events in India, usually in the fall. So it's really a hot spot to examine these questions of adaptation and environmental trade-offs. But then also from a personal reason, or a personal perspective, my family is originally from India. I was born in Canada and grew up in the U.S., but I always had this tie to India, and it's just been amazing to be able to go back and work in a community where my parents and family have grown up.
And you spent significant time there between your undergrad and grad school. Is that right?
Exactly, yeah. So my relationship with India, when I was a child, every 5 years or so, we would go back in the summers because most of my extended family is still there. But I really didn't have that long kind of time spent in the field until, as you mentioned, after college. I was fortunate enough to get a fellowship that allowed me to do independent research for a year. And then since then, I've been going back to India at least once or twice a year to spend time on the ground and maintain connections with my local collaborators.
That's fantastic. One of the findings or the outcomes that you talked about in your essay was related to water and irrigation, obviously, and the plight faced by these small farmers. But one of the findings was so interesting in that some of the areas at a small scale, there was actually room for them to irrigate more.
Yeah.
Can you talk more about that?
Yeah, completely. So just to provide a little bit more background on this project, I was spending a lot of time in the field trying to understand how farmers were responding to warming temperatures. And I kept hearing that one of the main adaptation strategies was to increase irrigation. And while this is beneficial for reducing negative impacts on yield, we became a little bit concerned because, as I mentioned, India has this groundwater depletion problem. So we did an analysis where we created a satellite data product measuring irrigation use and found that nationwide, farmers are increasing the amount of irrigation, and this is leading to more groundwater depletion. But there are parts of the country where there's room for additional irrigation use, primarily in the northeastern part of the country. So we've started working with our partner organizations to think about what are some additional strategies that can be used in these areas to help farmers adapt, given that they can rely a bit more on irrigation.
Yeah, and what an amazing outcome. And all over the world and even here locally, I'm going to put a plug in now for our podcast that dropped last week on water in the Colorado River here in Arizona. But everybody's faced with sort of how will we use water more wisely. So amazing outcome, for these small scale growers that are in the region. You mentioned already that, you're working with people in the region trying to help them use this information. Are there other examples you can share of how people are able to use your work sort of right now on the ground, kind of feeling the benefits that you're bringing?
Yeah, so I'll describe one project that is currently at the beginning stages, so not completely realized yet. I received a grant from a foundation called the S&R Evermay Foundation, and it was to create a satellite data product that could try to identify fields that were in stress and would eventually be low yielding at the end of the growing season, but to see whether we could identify those fields early in the season. And the hope is that we can then provide this information to agricultural extension agents who would then be able to target these fields in season to identify what the challenges are and hopefully help alleviate some of the problems.
That's incredible. And I'm familiar with agriculture extension agents through the context of sort of U.S. universities, land-grant institutions have often extension offices, but those are presumably all over and able to be engaged and help people to put into practice some of these things that your team is solving.
Exactly.
Will you tell us a little bit more about your personal journey and sort of how you got here? What sort of undergraduate and graduate experiences did you have, the sort of twists and turns you went through? How did you end up at this point in your career?
So as far as I could remember, I've always been very interested in the environment. When I was a young kid, I think I wanted to be a marine biologist at first, just knew that
Me
the
too.
environment the environment was just something that I wanted to work on. And in undergrad, I majored in ecology and did a lot of amazing fieldwork. I had really wonderful advisors. I got to go to Kenya and have an amazing fieldwork experience. But as I started doing more work in this field, I realized humans are inextricably linked to the environment, and I became much more passionate about how humans are interacting with the environment and our impacts. So I started to pursue that during my PhD. And during my PhD, I saw the power of remote sensing. So I never did any sort of satellite image analysis before going to grad school and starting my PhD. But after spending time in the field, even though household surveys are really wonderful, they give you this in-depth information about decision-making, I really wanted to understand what was really happening at scale. So I had an advisor, a co-advisor, who was a remote sensing expert and really learned a lot and was then able to marry those two tools together to do my work.
That's a fantastic example of, interdisciplinary research coming together to solve really pressing issues. And you mentioned last night when we were fortunate enough to have dinner together, you describe yourself as a geographer, but also have these other layers.
Yeah, great question. Yeah, so people will ask me what my field is, and it's a little bit hard. I'd say that, I'm closest to being a geographer, but I think that's because geography is very interdisciplinary. Mm-hmm. So technically, my degrees are in ecology and evolutionary biology, but especially in my PhD, I really broadened the types of classes that I took and the skill sets that I gained. So I actually did a certificate in environmental policy, and through that, I took classes in law, classes in human rights, classes in development economics. And all of those different classes, even though they seem very different and distinct, really informed the way that I think about the problems that I look at and allowed me to take a much more holistic view.
That's fantastic. I love it. And I hope that serves as some inspiration for folks who might be in grad school or undergrad right now trying to think about, how do I create the career that I think I want to have? But also, it's okay to explore.
Yeah.
Figure things out. Any advice you might have for early career researchers?
I think for me, I just always followed what I was passionate about, even if it meant that I had to pivot, maybe learn a new method or, learn a new body of literature. I found that to be really energizing, and it kept me really motivated. And I feel like it allowed me to bring together disparate fields that maybe traditionally hadn't been brought together. So that's my advice, just to follow your passion, do what allows you to come to work every day and feel excited.
I love it. One of the things we like to ask our guests as sort of a closing item is any recommended reading or any sources of information people might want to check out if they want to learn more about your area of research or related areas, things you think they should know.
Sure. I think maybe what I'll talk about are some books that were really kind of formative for the way that I started thinking about my work. So it's not necessarily about smallholder agriculture per se, but more about development and rural communities. So one book that was really informative to the way that I think is a book called Environmentality, written by Agarwal, who subsequently has actually become one of my mentors, and it's been a really wonderful relationship that really solidified my kind of passion and understanding of small-scale producers and rural communities working in the global south and the challenges that they face. And then another book that really inspired me was Amartya Sen's book, I forget the exact title right now, but discussing capability sets and once again really thinking about how do you define kind of possibilities in these systems and what are the constraints that people are facing.
Thank you so much for joining us. I really appreciate you taking the time out and for traveling such a great distance to join us for this great celebration of your essay and your award, and also for joining us on the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Welcome, Mayank. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me. I'm really excited.
Great. I am too. I can't wait to talk about your work, which is using the power of technology to reduce human trafficking, which is obviously a horrible problem worldwide. I'm getting on a plane today. I know that when I go to the restroom in the airports, there's a sign on the back of the stall door that says, "Are you here of your free will?" Basically, are you being coerced? It's a huge problem. Can you tell us why this is such a challenging problem to address right now?
Yes. So it turns out that the web has made human trafficking a lot worse. So it's always been there, but it used to be a very physical business, if you will, taking place in back alleys and the likes. But since 1998, the statistics have been truly shocking. So between 98 to 2018, there has been a 6,000 times increase in 6,000 times increase in child pornography on the web, and that is just what we know. So, that one statistic kind of really shows you the dark side of the web. So one of the questions that we try to address is, can we use the technology to turn the tables on the traffickers?
Can you define human trafficking for us?
So human trafficking is largely divided into two camps: labor trafficking and sex trafficking. I tend to study sex trafficking, which should be distinguished from sex work. Sex trafficking is a subset of sex work that tends to involve physical coercion, especially if it's not at the volition at all of the victim. And so the vast majority of human trafficking is still labor trafficking, but over 20% is sex trafficking, and it tends to involve women and children by and large.
You mentioned in your essay that the World Wide Web, it's messy. The information is messy and it's hard to sort through. Can you tell us more about why this is such a challenge to investigate for investigators?
So let's say if you search for my email address or my phone number, my work phone number, you'll find it very easily because I want it to be found. It's on my webpage. It's on LinkedIn. But, you would not be able to find a victim or a sex worker by their phone number because they have obfuscated it using symbols, using emojis. So typically, the way that they advertise is that when you go to a website that advertises this kind of service, they make it very easy to find someone by a physical characteristic because that is what the client might be looking for, but not by identifiers. And so law enforcement is trying to find someone by using a phone number or, maybe the last phone number they had before they went missing in some cases, or an email address or a social media handle or something like that. But they can't actually find anyone that way because it's all obfuscated. So it's really difficult to search on the web. And that is one of the big reasons why we need technology to link billions of data points so we can map these networks of human trafficking and find victims.
And the tool you built is called DIG. Tell us more about DIG.
So DIG stands for Domain-Specific Insight Graphs. So let me break that down a little bit. So a domain-specific search engine is something like Amazon, which we're all familiar with. It's for e-commerce. So in the case of Amazon, or Yelp for reviews, or YouTube for videos, there's a specific domain. So DIG is a domain-specific search engine for human trafficking. So it's given to law enforcement agencies to address the challenge that I just spoke about earlier, which is how do we quickly find a victim using the last known phone number, using physical characteristics, using any other information that we might have. And then how do we find other people who might be linked to the victim? So this is the insight part of DIG, which is how do we very easily get law enforcement to have sophisticated insights that would take them years, if not months, to determine. So just to give you an example, let's say someone goes missing. We have very little information about them. Maybe we have a picture before they went missing, but that's going to change because once they are trafficked, their physical appearance will change, their phone number will change, they'll basically disappear, off of the digital world and come back in a new guise. And so how do we link the two is a very hard AI problem. So what Dig does is it uses AI to gather a lot of data points from sex advertisements across the internet. It links them together and it puts it behind an interface that law enforcement can use to gain the kind of insights that would allow them to rescue victims.
That's amazing. And I imagine really this tool wouldn't be possible prior to this sort of widespread adoption of AI.
Yeah, it actually preceded AI. So we were working on the tool. I joined USC in 2016, but the project was around from 2014 to 2018. So in the last 2 or 3 years of the project, which was funded by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, the AI was taking off, but we didn't have the large language models or any of the AI that we have today. So it was very challenging to build AI that had high enough quality, that was scalable. It's never perfect. And so we were always talking to stakeholders that even if we're not perfect, how do we do a good enough job that we are helping you to truncate months and years of effort into days? We don't want to completely automate the process because we always want a human in the loop with something so sensitive. But our goal was, how do we meet you where you are? And instead of taking a year, we turn it into a week. And so this way you can investigate many more cases. In the case of prosecutors and district attorneys' offices, we wanted to make sure that the tool could be used to find evidence that then allows them to put traffickers behind bars. And there were a few success stories, but we were able to gather evidence through the tool that actually did allow prosecutors to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that the victims were getting trafficked.
What an amazing outcome. You mentioned, this is sensitive data. Enforcement officials are using this for legitimate purposes, but is there any risk to Dig? This is a powerful surveillance tool. Are there privacy concerns for individuals out there? How do we mitigate those two competing worries that people have sometimes?
Yeah, it's a great question. We explicitly designed the tool so that it only goes after the domain-specific websites that have interest over here. And so these were sex work websites where we do know a lot of trafficking, and especially child trafficking does happen a lot. There is a privacy concern with respect to sex workers because they are victims in this, and we don't want them to be victimized even further. There's no way the technology can prevent that. So it was really important for us to work with our partners in law enforcement to ensure that it wasn't getting used for that. One of the pieces of evidence that gave me a lot of hope and that it was being used for the right purpose is that the Manhattan Human Trafficking Resource Unit gave us some data very early on in the project where it turned out that the number of prostitution arrests that they were making in Manhattan went down very significantly. But the fraction of arrests that they were investigating for human trafficking went from less than 1% to more than 62% after the tool was rolled out. The reason why this is so significant is because even if you are an undocumented immigrant or you don't have any paperwork, if under the law, if there is reason to believe that you are being trafficked, then there are certain protections, refugee protections and other protections that kick in where you're safe. And you also get a lot of resources, to rehabilitate you and to give you the resources that are necessary for you to recover from the trauma.
So this is really an amazing example of the power of AI coming in, really facilitating the sort of rapid kind of acceleration of this tool and AI being used for good in this context. Can you tell us more about your personal journey and sort of how you got here to this point where you were doing this really inspiring research?
So I grew up in India. I went to a very academically rigorous school that was very deep into math and science. So I was always very interested in computer science and math and physics, but I thought I wanted to be a physicist. So when I came to University of Illinois at the age of 19, I double majored in physics and electrical and computer engineering. And I had the good fortune where I was introduced to someone in the National Center for Supercomputing Applications at UIUC. And I got my first research experience during the summer, and I just fell in love with it, just reading papers and going into depth. And it was just something that just clicked. And I decided that I could not give that up and I should go and pursue a PhD. And so went on to University of Texas at Austin. My research area was fairly boring. In a way, I'm still involved in that, but it was an AI area and it had nothing to do with crime or human trafficking or anything like that. And I wasn't planning to go into academia after that. I had an industry job lined up, and I was invited by some researchers who I knew very well. I mean, I'd read all their papers, and so I looked up to them, and I ran into them in conferences, and they were at USA. And they were like, well, there's this really interesting project on human trafficking. It fits very perfectly with your research. We need to apply the AI that you're building now to this problem. And so, if you are open at all, just come down, give a talk. And, it's the worst that will happen is you will have come down to Los Angeles for a couple of days. That's not too bad. And then, if you decide it's not for you, then you can go on to what you were thinking of doing before. So I went to the institute and I just fell in love with it. The Information Sciences Institute at USC, which is my home institution.
Any advice you'd offer for early career researchers?
So this is going to sound a little bit strange, but my advice would be trust serendipity. Don't overplan. I think sometimes I see, especially the, young people, I think for good reasons, they see that the world is very competitive and they have this notion that, okay, I need to check all these boxes. I need to publish here, or I need to do this, or I need to have accomplished this by my second year and by my fourth year. And I need to have these line items on my resume. And I'm not saying that's not important. Of course, you should have some kind of plan and all of that. But I would say don't overplan. Like, think of this as 70% is planning and 30% you have to trust the world. That's my one piece of advice, which is say yes to many things. Take an exploratory view, trust serendipity, don't overplan. And, you will be surprised by the wonderful things that are waiting for you out there.
I like the word serendipity. It feels perfect. One of the last things we asked folks is, if somebody hears the podcast and wants to learn more about this or related areas, are there books or other places you would steer them to check out if they want to keep learning, or books that inspired you that got you started in this process?
If anyone is interested in very specific books, there was a great book written about Backpage, which was a huge website that had a lot of sex work ads, and it got taken down. But I really love reading old books. So I was just thinking about Max Weber, who was a great German sociologist. And he did these two lectures. One of them, they called the vocation lectures. I believe he gave them at a university or some kind of audience. It was not intended as a book. But one of the lectures was called Science as a Vocation. Usually they publish just two lectures, Science as a Vocation and Politics as a Vocation. I don't recommend reading the second one unless you're very interested in politics. But I think for us scientists, Science as a Vocation was an incredible lecture. I mean, I read it and it still resonates today. And it really reminds me why we choose to become scientists. A much more recent book called, I believe it's called The Information or
Oh, sure. I am also familiar with
by
the
James
information.
Gleick.
Yep.
I think it's by James Gleick,
That's right,
who I
James
believe
Gleick.
is a science historian of science at Harvard. I think that it really gives you a very deep 400-year perspective on a concept that seems so simple on the surface and involves so much intricacy. And to me, that's the beauty of scientific discovery.
I also agree. That's a terrific book. Thank you so much for joining us. This has been a lot of fun.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you to Meha and Mayank for joining us today, and thank you to Lara for hosting. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed the show, please leave us a 5-star review on the podcast app of your choice. If you want to learn more about AAAS and support their work, consider joining the AAAS member community. More information in the show notes. Hey, remember, lab coats are optional on this show, but we want to keep our researchers safe in the lab, so wear your PPE. Lab Coat Optional is a production of the talented people at the Knowledge Enterprise Strategic Marketing and Communications team. Knowledge Enterprise is led by Executive Vice President Sally C. Morton, who's right over here. Hi, Sally.
Until next time, stay curious.